folks. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to the third Tulane School of Architecture Spring Lecture in our 2021 series, Inhabiting the Planet. Here we discuss how humans are and could be inhabiting Earth from different disciplinary perspectives, and how architecture intersects with social, environmental, economic, racial, and health issues. Tonight's event is the annual William Koch Memorial Lecture, and we gratefully acknowledge the sponsors for their continued support. Presenting this evening is Tulane class of 2003 alumna, Dr. Sara Jensen Carr, who will be focusing on the public health aspects of inhabiting the planet. After her lecture, Sara will be joined by two respondents for an interdisciplinary conversation. They are Dr. Thomas A. Leviste, Dean and Weatherhead Presidential Chair in Health Equity at the Tulane School of Public Health, and Professor Ann Yoakum of the Tulane School of Architecture, who directs the school's Albert and Tina Small Center for Collaborative Design on Barone Street. Toward the end of that conversation, we'll take questions from the audience. Please type them into the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen for participants to peruse and select. As always, succinct questions are more likely to get selected than lengthy commentaries. Now to introduce our guest. Dr. Sara Jensen Carr is an assistant professor of architecture and the program director for the Master of Design in Sustainable Urban Environments program at Northeastern University in Boston. She's a licensed architect and holds a MArch from Tulane and an MLA and PhD in environmental planning from UC Berkeley. Her research on connections among urban landscape, human health, and social equity has been funded by the Mellon, Graham, and National Science Foundations. In addition, Sara has been published in outlets from Preventive Medicine to LA Plus Journal and interviewed by the New York Times, CNN, and Foreign Policy, among others, for her expertise on epidemics and urban design. Her forthcoming book, The Topography of Wellness, How Health and Disease Shaped the American Urban Landscape, will be published by the University of Virginia Press later this year. So everybody, please welcome Sara. And Sara, welcome home. It's all yours.
Thank you. I very much wish it was in person. So let me start from the beginning here. So I see Anne's background Zoom and wish I was having a wine out of a plastic cup and Richardson and a slice of cheese. I imagine that tradition hasn't changed in the past several years. So yeah, so thank you so much for having me back tonight. So unfortunately, speaking to you from my home, which is now in Boston, not in New Orleans, and as appropriate for a talk about landscape and health, I just wanted to start by thanking and acknowledging that I sit on the occupied territory of the Wampanoag and Massachusetts tribe. And I want to express my gratitude for their stewardship of the land, which fosters all of our health, despite the generations of injustice inflicted upon them. So thank you, Rich, very much for the introduction. Thank you to Dean Alday for inviting me, to Kristen for organizing, and especially Ann Yoakum and Dean Leviste for taking time out of your busy schedule to be respondents tonight. My time at Tulane, for those students that are listening, I just wanted to let you know that my time at Tulane and in New Orleans was extremely formative for me in a number of ways, which I'll elaborate on in more detail in a moment. I would say my closest friends today are actually the ones I made in studio at Tulane. So we're still quite close. So, be kind to each other, continue those friendships. I actually ended up staying in New Orleans quite some time past graduation for about 9 years altogether. And in fact, just a few months before the pandemic hit, my last pre-pandemic trip was back to New Orleans for a friend's wedding. So yes, very much wish I was there with you tonight, but happy to be with you in digital space. Although as a returning alumna, I think I'm here to discuss what have I been doing since I left Tulane. So as I mentioned, I stayed in New Orleans for a while. I actually worked for a couple local firms in New Orleans, worked for Perez and Blitch Knevel Architects, two firms that I know are still around. And at the latter, I mostly worked on healthcare projects, both in New Orleans and in Gulfport, Mississippi. And it was during that time that I became interested in evidence-based design, which is applied research on healthcare environments and their effect on healing, efficiency, mental health, and worker satisfaction, among other topics. And it was from there that I ended up switching paths into landscape architecture. And my first academic appointment after my PhD was actually a joint appointment in the School of Architecture and Office of Public Health Studies at University of Hawaii at Manoa. So that was about 7 years ago. And I feel that when I was there, again, things have changed since then. People would always ask me, so what is an architect doing teaching in a school of public health? But it was, another great formative experience for me, experience to truly work in an interdisciplinary setting. So interdisciplinary, not just meaning architects and landscape architects, like we sometimes talk about in architecture school. Um, and I've had a lot of great applied experiences since then. I work with an advisory board, Design for Active Sacramento, which is made up of a team originally funded by the APA, but continues again. And that includes transportation engineers, public health officers, advocates, planners, physicians, and even a neurosurgeon. Together we were able to contribute to the last iteration of the Sacramento County design guidelines. So these are all professions that are invested in shaping the built environment for health, and actually being the only architect was a great experience, and translating that to design. In Hawaii, when my appointment with the Office of Public Health Studies, I led a study on active transportation infrastructure in rural communities and around the planned monorail in Oahu. What you see there is the app that we built, so we could send it to our colleagues on other islands to understand what the potential was for active transportation there. And now I'm in Boston, and among other things, I'm working with a research team that's examining the mental health burden of climate change on young adults. You can see a page from the journals that we're sending out to people right now. And then another project looking at the demographics and urban landscapes of climate change events. And so I would say, that work, there's a lot of opportunity for working in policy, applied research, and especially the translations to design. But mainly what I'm here to talk about tonight is something that's always interested me in the background is, what do changes in the landscape mean for health, and especially its implications for already dramatic health disparities. As I mentioned, I was in Hawaii just before I moved to Boston a couple of years ago, and I'm continuing some research that I started there. One looking at the development of the ahapua on Oahu, which is a native Hawaiian system of socio-ecological division to ensure collective abundance and resilience, and how its traces can be read and restored in Honolulu. Essentially, the question that drives my research is this: how does the design of buildings, landscapes, and the public realm heal or harm us? And that question really originated because of my time in New Orleans, and especially my experience after Hurricane Katrina. So I was living there when Hurricane Katrina hit. Like those that were privileged to, I evacuated. Like those that were more privileged to, I was able to come back when many were not able to. And for some time, like everybody, my life was really consumed with the recovery, whether it was doing FEMA surveys, rehabilitating climate buildings, going to community planning meetings. In the absence of hospitals, which is what the landscape was for some time, I really started to wonder, what were the effects of the landscape and what were the effects of these changes on health? And that's what really led me to get my MLA. And I think I naively thought I would come up with some sort of landscape guidelines for health, similar how you might read the AIA guidelines for hospitals. But even then, I realized it's actually much more complicated than that. I had already seen how the landscape could be wielded to displace people in the name of well-being and safety and resilience. In particular, the type of unspecified top-down green space plans that we often see in these vision plans. So this is, of course, the infamous green dot map, which was released by the Bring New Orleans Back Commission after Hurricane Katrina, which just widely deemed low-lying areas to be raised for essentially what were parks, or what we call flood parks today. And obviously this is discomforting for anybody that lived there, And to be in New Orleans during the recovery and hear this conversation, constant conversation about rebuilding healthier, right, and rebuilding better, and what was implied in that really drove me to look for maybe more specific answers about what that meant. And so while I did, and I still strongly believe in the power of urban landscapes in addressing health, I did start to become skeptical of how these conversations were framed and how we talked about health. What are those frameworks? So in an effort to better understand how our present day landscape shapes our health, I wanted to understand the history of shifting ideas about the public health and the public realm. And so, and unfortunate or fortunate timing, I'm not sure. I've been working on this for about a decade now, and my book is just coming out this summer, which is looking at different epidemics. And I'll be talking about specifically the book content in more detail tonight. I wanted to clarify, I'm not a historian. I am a designer, albeit one that works in an academic context. But I'm just thinking about how the landscapes we inhabit were shaped around health and how that might inform our movements in the future. And I will also admit, as someone who's been looking at how health and diseases have formed the urban landscape for a decade now, I'm honestly still trying to wrap my head around what the COVID-19 pandemic means. And I'd love to hear Anne and Dr. Levy's thought as well tonight on this. I don't have any predictions about its future, but what I want to talk about tonight is the history of American epidemics and how they got us to this landscape we currently inhabit, and what we must keep in mind at this inflection point in time. Now, the places we live are inextricably tied to our health. And in fact, the modern day diseases, pre-pandemic, and I think we'll find with the pandemic as well, they're a complicated knot of genetic, lifestyle, and environmental factors. In 2016, Karen DeSalvo, who was then the interim secretary of the US Department of Health and Human Services, noted that public health had entered a new era where one's zip code is a better indicator of health than genetic code. But I was also wondering about this change, that in the Industrial Revolution, cities were often seen as the locus of bad health. And in fact, they were for a long time. But the conversation started to shift in the late 90s and early 2000s. Instead, the area that we saw as a place of bad health was a more car-centric, suburban or exurban environment. So prior to the current pandemic, and again, this may shift how we see places, how we see the urban gradient today, it was a pretty dramatic shift in what we view as a healthy or unhealthy environment. So loosely, I would posit that over time, in response to epidemics, we have designed environments to control miasma, germs, and behavior. So starting with miasma, Hippocrates on airs, waters, and places connected the health of the environment to the health of those who inhabit it. His writings describe the difference between wholesome and unwholesome waters, the latter being marshy and stagnant, and talking about those who drank from them having large and obstructed spleens, hard bellies, being emaciated and hot. And these theories had wide acceptance well into the 20th century, most notably in the form of miasma theory, which associated tangibly foul air and water to airborne disease. And the first movement connecting the built environment to population health correlates with the beginning of American urban history during the Industrial Revolution. As factories and workforce populations grew in city centers, so did the amount of waste and sewage dumped in the streets. Slaughterhouses were often still inside city limits. There was no municipal sanitation, and air pollution was rampant. Many housing units lacked indoor plumbing or sufficient light and fresh air. Massive outbreaks of cholera, typhoid, and yellow fever pretty much demanded coordinated action between planners, engineers, public health officials, and doctors in the fields. And of particular concern were crowded tenements. This cartoon, featured in Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper in 1865, was entitled "The Tenement Houses of New York, How the Poor Live in Crowded Cities, How Pestilence is Generated, and How Parents are Demoralized and Their Children Depraved, the Great Source of Destitution and Crime," therein linking health to some sort of moral failing. Social scientists who were just beginning to explore the connections between environment and behavior pointed to physical density as a risk factor for moral contagion as well as disease spread. And cholera and the associated filth diseases became ever more correlated with the generalized urban condition, especially regarding dense housing. Here we see cholera as a skeleton telling the landlord of a tenement that he is about to occupy the premises. And tenements were routinely described as perpetual fever nests by New York sanitary inspectors in their surveys. And so the first biggest changes to the American landscape came from this massive sanitary infrastructure movement. It was during this time that many combined sewage, wastewater, and street runoff systems were installed in cities. Naturally open waterways, which often served as worker encampments, as well as waste conveyance, became contained in underground culverts and were paved over. Marshlands were filled in not only to get rid of miasmic gases, but also to accommodate industrial expansion and remove people that lived there. The outfall of these waste systems was often still in open water bodies, but at least it was moved out of the city. And many subscribe to the idea that, quote unquote, the solution to pollution is dilution. What is interesting to note is that these are many of the same systems that are still in place today. And also interesting to note that actually there was a significant body of scientists and doctors that did not believe in miasma theory or that disease was spread through the air. They knew that it was actually ingested in the water. But still, miasma theory had held the population or had become so popular in the population that what it spurred on was a multi-pronged strategy of personal and municipal sanitation, a move to alleviate density and remaking or removing industry and worker housing, which radically remade the haphazard landscape of American cities. You can see here, and this is from the June 22nd, 1895 edition of Harper's Weekly, comparing photos of the same street corners just 2 years apart, showing what an incredible transformation street cleaning, street paving, and municipal sanitation had brought to the city. And so waste infrastructure really reconfigured the streets of cities. They became longer, straighter, wider. Sometimes even cobblestones were thought to hold miasmic airs between them, and so they were switched out for Belgian pavement that could be washed down at the end of the day. Many were also looking to Europe to see how they had controlled their own cholera epidemics, and specifically their underground waste infrastructure. In his book, Flesh and Stone, Richard Sennett discussed how many 18th and 19th century cities prioritized circulation and movement via their street networks in the wake of physician William Harvey's discoveries about how the heart powered blood circulation. Dirt and grime were thought to clog healthy airs throughout the city. Palaces and places of commerce acted as hearts that powered movement, and one-way streets were often employed to maintain fast movement and mimic the directionality of veins and arteries. And we can see that inspiration very clearly in Daniel Burnham's plan of Chicago, but also in the writings of Frederick Law Olmsted. After streets and sanitary infrastructure transformed American cities, many started to look to parks as another way to literally breathe fresh air into the urban environment. So Frederick Law Olmsted, the designer of Central Park, actually served for some time as the executive secretary of the U.S. Sanitary Commission. And he was able to leverage that public health knowledge and also fear about the detrimental health effects of urban diseases to advocate for the health benefits of large green spaces, not only for pumping clean air into the city, but providing a mental health respite from the business of the city. And he seems very forward-looking, and Olmsted in one of his writings actually described what we might call ecosystem services today. Writing about the importance of parks, Olmsted wrote, "Air is disinfected by sunlight and foliage. Foliage also acts mechanically to purify the air by screening it. Opportunity and inducement to escape at frequent intervals from the confined and vitiated air of the commercial quarter, and to supply the lungs with air screened and purified by trees and recently acted upon by sunlight, together with opportunity and inducement to escape from conditions requiring vigilance, wariness, and activity toward other men." The hunt for fresh air also pushed westward expansion. And in fact, it was a large driver of the move to Western cities like Phoenix and Denver, which grew significantly by specifically recruiting asthmatics. In fact, Dr. Charles Dennison's Rocky Mountain Health Resorts advertised Colorado as the Switzerland of the Americas, evoking images of clean mountain air and the generally accepted superior moral values of Europeans. And this map by Dennison attempts to show the climatic patterns of Colorado, specifically its dry, cool air. Again, he would associate good health with good morals. Writing about Colorado Springs, he said, "It is the home also of a cultivated class of people who have been attracted to the state by health conditions." It was estimated that up to a quarter of people who settled in Colorado, Arizona, and California in the late 1800s and very early 1900s did so for their health or family members' health. Ironically, agriculture and increasing irrigation supported plant growth, and many developed allergies. Even so, by 1890, Denver had grown by almost a third, with almost 30,000 people moving there to treat consumption, and that rate of growth would persist for the next 3 decades. So these commonly accepted ideas of how the environment affected health were upended with the development of vaccines. The immediacy of infectious disease abated somewhat, but it didn't stop architects and landscape architects from exploring how germ theory might apply to their designs. Knowing that the pandemics of the early 1900s, namely flu and tuberculosis, could be addressed by medicine, density no longer became an immediate concern, but thinking about how architecture could optimize bodies and health like medicine had was still a fascination to many. Of course, chief among them, Le Corbusier. The Radiant City was actually a gesture towards Ebenezer Gardens Howard City, or sorry, Ebenezer Howard's Garden City, in of itself a plan that centered around health. But basically, these actions were taken vertically. Corbusier envisioned all interactions as internal to the building itself, and so the street as a public realm was eliminated. Corbusier thought he was liberating his building's residents from this filth and grime. Corbusier's machines for living were intensely focused on what the right measurements were for an individual, and created a community simply by reproducing those units over and over again. Just as an example, Corbusier had very specific ideas on what a healthy unit looked like. For instance, it would have 14 square meters per occupant per apartment, 12 meters of plate glass window to let in the exact amount of sunlight. The air would always be at 64.4 degrees Fahrenheit, and there would be 8 liters of air to go through the room every minute for what he called exact respiration. He also thought that the building's residents should walk no more than 100 meters to transport, whether it be elevator or a taxi waiting on the ground. And only 50 meters above ground level would give occupants pure air, which begs the question of who had to live below the 50-meter mark. And although while Corbusier only has one built work in the United States, we can see the influence of his writing and of course the European consortium SIAM in many public housing units built in the mid-century. However, without the context of the European social safety net and the purposeful lack of maintenance in these buildings, many of the ideas that they pushed, extreme density to keep green space around buildings, reimagining the corridor as a place of social interaction, and perhaps most of all, the aesthetic disruption and separation from existing contexts ended up being detrimental to resident health instead. And the mixed metaphors of bodies and cities were also wielded to ruinous ends in the mid-century. At this time, cancer was an epidemic that researchers soon realized could not be conquered by vaccines, even so, as much as they tried. A federally funded early 1960s study attempted to inject hundreds of monkeys with human tumors in a desperate effort to pinpoint a cancer germ, but to no avail. In Susan Sontag's Illness as Metaphor, written in 1977, she confronts the late 20th century era's preoccupation with cancer by comparing it to the previous TB epidemic, saying, "Now it is cancer's turn to be the disease that doesn't knock before it enters. Cancer that fills the role of an illness experiences a ruthless secret invasion, a role it will keep until one day its etiology becomes as clear and its treatment as effective as those of TB have become." The unknowability of cancer is what made it so terrifying, but also made it an apt way to communicate the direness of the urban condition and spur action. The concurrent epidemic of urban disinvestment, disintegration, and abandonment, commonly referred to as blight, often leaned as cancer as a metaphor, especially as it appeared to similarly eat cities from the inside out in the form of fire, vice, and crime. Geographer Michael Deere wrote that the process of abandonment as it operates in space suggests an initial broad scattering of abandoned structures, characterized internally by the occurrence of many small groups of abandoned houses. It is essentially a contagious sequence. contagion has major implications for our understanding of the dynamics of abandonment and for later policy considerations. And this treatment of blight as a disease extended to its documentation. Much like cholera before it, blighted properties were documented by public health agencies from going door to door, searching for its vectors of contagion. And in fact, in 1951, Architectural Forum magazine advertising slum surgery in St. Louis showed blighted or obsolete districts beginning to encroach on the rest of the city grid, the former district shaded as if to erase their existing characteristics. We can see the inspiration in those blight maps from thinking about how cancer was represented at this time. This is from an educational film from 1953 entitled The Warning Shadow, which used X-ray animations to depict the terrifying growth of a small black dysplasia on a man's lung. The film ends with the patient agreeing to a pneumonectomy or surgical removal of the lung. Eradication by surgery or radium was the preferred treatment for cancer, and that would extend to treatments for urban blight. Architects and planners seized upon this as a model for how blight should be treated in cities. Many municipal departments, aided by private companies like the Rand Corporation, first attempted quote-unquote immunizations, such as increased municipal services, including fire and police stations, and attempts to enforce stricter building codes. But when this failed, they turned toward an urban chemotherapy, the total eradication of clusters of blight. In his book, The City, Its Growth, Its Decay, Its Future, E.L.L. Sarnan used these diagrams of the disintegration of cells to discuss the disintegration of the fabric of the city and a healthy cell as a model for rebuilding. Sarnan wrote, "The slums he clears by piecemeal mending, and the old infects the new in short order. The planner must know, as well as the doctor, that when the head aches, the stomach might be out of order. And the planner must be aware of the fact, as well as the doctor, that vitality cannot be transfused into a dead organ. The dead organ must be removed and the transfusion effected in a healthy part of the body. He must unearth the roots of evil. He must amputate slums by a decisive surgery, and he must transfuse vitality only into those areas that are protected against contagion." As they had in the sanitary movement, children were often invoked as innocent victims in order to further the cause. James W. Fullen, Commissioner of the Urban Renewal Administration, in a talk called Slums and Blight, A Disease of Urban Life, showed Gussie, a cartoon depiction of a waif-like young white girl, as proxy for the deadly effect of slums on human lives. She's introduced standing on a pile of rubble or adrift on a sea of blight, and the book shows a series of maps overlaying juvenile delinquency, lack of sanitation, tuberculosis, and population density, with the densest occurrences, as Fullen says, always pointing to the center of cities. Later, Gussie is shown wielding the gargantuan broom of code enforcement. You can see it here on the left, of health and sanitation to address blight. And so to address the issue, urban renewal documents, all the way from New York City, which you see at the bottom, to San Francisco, which you see on the top, depicted strikingly similar landscapes, sleek, sterile towers on a flat platform of green. San Francisco's Jackson Square plan, which is up on the top there, is shown as isolated from any existing fabric, save for City Hall, with no mention of the Fillmore neighborhood as a cultural center for the West Coast small Black population at the time. Indeed, 80% of those removed by urban renewal were Black, and in Baltimore, that number was reported to be 100%. The logic of blight as disease was eradication, erasure, and reoccupation with a quote-unquote healthy graft of anonymous towers in green. So lastly, that brings us to our immediate pre-pandemic era, where the trend has been towards more shaping for behavior. And this is because of another specific disease, that of obesity. The CDC reported that in the US, the percentage of overweight adults hovered around 31% between 1960 and 1994. And the percentage of adults categorized as obese increased from 13% to 23%. Meaning almost 55% of adults in the mid-1990s were overweight or obese. In 2005, it was estimated that obesity incurred over 190 billion, or almost 21% of all US healthcare expenditures. And researchers started to draw connections between larger patterns of change in society, ranging from food availability and technological attachment to the epidemic. And a great deal of literature started to point to sedentary lifestyles encouraged by the unabated suburban growth oriented around the automobile as a driver of the epidemic. By the end of the 20th century, the locus of disease would shift from the city to the suburbs. These figures notwithstanding, the definition of obesity is still problematic in many respects, from the unreliability of the BMI and its relationship to overall health to cultural and racial ideas of ideal bodies and diets. Nevertheless, many designers and urban planners saw an opportunity to elevate their practice in the name of public health, but instead exacerbated health inequities. And on a related point, though, many also pointed out that car-centric design exacerbates climate change in urban heat islands, which represents a larger existential health threat to all. The tonic proposed to rampant suburban development was the new urbanism movement, which was based on highly specific urban and architectural code to build neo-traditional neighborhoods. Although not directly referenced, the American Public Health Association's book, Planning the Neighborhood from some 30 years prior, is an obvious predecessor to much of their literature, especially in the preoccupation with density formulas, land use, and architectural form. And some of the generalized observations and principles of suburban nation written by the firm Dwani Plater Zyberk were common sense and maybe even admirable in theory. But when enacted on the ground, it became almost immediately problematic. In their steadfast belief that the old way of building was best, they emphasized the historical blind spots of building for social change and then uncritically doubled down. In fact, Dwani Plater Zyberk's urban codes were meant to be a prescriptive landscape, not just to address obesity, but a claim to also improve social cohesion, civic participation, and above all, eliminate cars from the public realm. The early new urbanists were particularly taken with regional interpretations of European architecture in the Deep South. Dwani and Plater Zyberk have cited that their inspirations came from a road trip in towns such as Savannah, Charleston, and Natchez, Mississippi, but don't reference the racial, social, or class systems inherent in those different forms of dwelling. The willingness of governments to invest in the supposedly curative effects of new urbanism also became apparent when in the mid-1990s it was adopted as the standard architectural and planning style of public housing under the Clinton administration's Hope 6 development plans. Hope 6 did attempt to take some lessons learned from the disastrous mid-century modernist public housing developments, proposing a scattered site strategy that would strategically infill often slightly higher income neighborhoods with smaller scale building. But just as in the mid-century, the tactic of adopting a specific aesthetic for public housing, even if it was neo-traditionalism instead of modernism, still served to visually stigmatize those within, while continuing to imply that those living in it would be uplifted and have their morals corrected through architecture. Much like the modernist building of the mid-century, the failure of Hope 6 was also a failure of administration and not so much on design. But what happened was with the Hope 6 program, as those high density units were torn down to build new but less numerous mid-scale ones, the displacement that occurred was also one of the larger detriments to resident health. Nevertheless, the built environment is still widely viewed as a treatment for the epidemic. It's extending from the figurative prescription of new urbanism to now literally being prescribed by the US Surgeon General, then during the Obama administration, now our US Surgeon General again, as seen in this 2015 Step It Up campaign. To provide an environment that provides for walking and biking is definitely positive, but it will take a lot more to untangle our car-centric environments. And as cities and walkable environments have become more in demand, these ostensibly healthier and greener neighborhoods have also become less affordable. So we need to interrogate the idea that at the same time, the design, planning, and even public health community denigrates the suburb as being unhealthy. It's also a time where suburbs are becoming more racially and economically heterogeneous, a far cry from those described 30 years ago in suburban nation. Moreover, we need to rethink the idea that in the United States that where we live is a free choice, or that it always reflects someone's moral fortitude or preferences. But this is sadly appropriate for a country that has always conflated wellness with personal responsibility. So here we are at the COVID-19 pandemic, and when I try to conceptualize where we go from here, what I do find really interesting about COVID-19 is it's a combination of all of our fears of the past century rolled up in one illness. And it feels like we've seen a century pass by in the past year. The built environment does provide opportunities for and risks to health. And our conception of healthy places changes with medical knowledge and different pandemics. But what we have seen is that healthy places are often only for people that can afford them. And as these fears are made urgent again with COVID-19, for instance, we know now that it is airborne, which gives credence to miasma. We might still be sanitizing our surfaces or even our groceries. We've changed our behavior to socially distance and quarantine. So it really is all these lessons wrapped up again. At the same time, many of the ways past epidemics have been addressed in the urban environment have also proven to be consistent to today's pandemic. We know that green space is essential, sanitation is key, and the design of where we live shapes essential access. But instead of speculating on this, and I don't think this is the future of post-pandemic design, what I'd like to offer instead before closing is a cautionary tale and what we can learn from these movements of the past. There is another consistency between everything I've talked about here, in that every epidemic and the most misguided or experimental of built environment cures always affects immigrants and communities of color. This is a country, in fact, founded on the removal of its indigenous people, who were first decimated by the epidemics brought by colonizers, and then were systematically and forcibly moved off land they had stewarded for decades, while settlers celebrated their quote-unquote unspoiled quality and built resorts and cabins there for their own health. This painting by Thomas Cole celebrates the American landscape that we associate with fresh air and water devoid of man's pollution, but sublimates the solitary figure of a Native American man hidden in the bottom foreground of the picture, the absence of his tribe speaking as much as his hidden presence. In this cartoon from Puck magazine, cholera is conflated with newcomers. The title of the piece called "The Kind of Assisted Immigrant We Cannot Afford to Admit." And of course, cholera depicted as a skeleton in vaguely Middle Eastern clothing. And health as a lever of removal and racism has been made very clear in some of the housing covenants of the early 20th century. In 1922, a covenant for Silver Spring, Maryland read, "For the purposes of sanitation and health, no owner will sell or lease the said land to anyone of a race whose death rate is at a higher percentage than the white race." In San Francisco's Chinatown, disease was used as a justification for the Department of Public Health to repeatedly raid and control the neighborhood's boundaries. And medical inspections and largely fabricated assessments on nearby Angel Island were also used to keep Chinese out of the city altogether. So we have to consider how health has been used to exclude groups from desirable landscapes and conscribe them to landscapes of risk. A recent study from a group of University of California researchers argued that we need to reckon with how social and policy practice has long-lasting physiological effects. By overlaying mortgage companies' redlining maps with health data, they not only found that these neighborhoods were still largely occupied by communities of color and immigrants, but that there remained a plethora of environmental hazards from air pollution to high lead content in soil, resulting in, among other disparities in health, a 3 times higher asthma rate in Black communities than whites in the Bay Area. And we also cannot forget that even the most celebrated healthy landscape, Central Park, designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, who had a background in public health, and who was also an abolitionist, as well as being a public health officer and a landscape architect. Nevertheless, the park was built on the ruins of Seneca Village, which was a thriving Black village that was nonetheless written up as a squatter's camp, squalid and pestilent in the popular press to advocate forest removal. So instead of thinking about decontamination rooms or plexiglass desks, I think we need to be asking ourselves about the conditions that cause urban heat islands and air pollution disproportionately in Black neighborhoods, which have now proven to be underlying causes for COVID mortality. Instead of worrying about the conception of a very specific type of walkable and bikeable density that has dominated urban design discourse for the past couple decades, we should concern ourselves with the crowded housing for frontline workers. And what we can take away from this is that the environment does not cause or cure disease, but it is a key factor in either providing opportunities for health or creating the risk of debilitating illness. The landscapes we inhabit embed themselves in our bones and organs. Some of these pathways are known and some are not. In her essay, Shifting Sites, landscape architect Christina Hill discussed how in culture and in ecological science, we have long viewed our skin as a boundary between us and the natural world, but instead we should think of it as one that is permeable to energy, to materials, and organisms. And as we now know, the burdens of an inequitable social system, which accumulates illness, but can also build resiliency over generations. And so as we endure this crisis we are currently in and understand there are others ahead of us, let us take what we have learned from history and use that to shape a healthier future for all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sara. At this point in our evening, we're going to shift over to a three-way conversation led by our respondents, Professor Ann Yoakum and Dean Thomas Leviste, after which we'll open it up for questions. Dean Leviste, would you like to kick us off?
Sure. Well, first, I want to thank you for that presentation. It was quite interesting, especially for someone who is not in architecture to listen to this and see the parallels between what you all are doing in architecture and what we're doing in public health. We may be using different words to describe the same thing, but I think we're in many ways describing the same thing. And I think this certainly makes me that much more interested in learning more about what you guys are doing over there in architecture and what we can do together. Because ultimately what we need to do is move to the next phase, which is how do we find solutions to these problems. Your comments made me think of an early conversation I had with the mayor who called me up one day. I think we had just met for the first time, maybe a week or so prior. And she called me up and said, I need you to come in and meet with me. There's something I need to talk to you about. Didn't tell me what it was. So I went to her office and walked in, and there were several other people in the room. And I'm like, and it was just this sense of foreboding, forbidding when I walked in. I was like, what is going on here? And she started talking about a problem that they were having that was not yet in the press, but knew that it was going to be published in the press soon, and they needed to get on top of this. And the problem was that some of the infrastructure in the city for handling water, which is obviously a big issue for this city, a city surrounded by water, a city underground surrounded by water. Below sea level surrounded by water. What could possibly go wrong? But anyway, we rely on that infrastructure, and she was talking about some of that old infrastructure and how it was actually contaminating the water, and that the amount of money that would be needed to deal with that. And she needed someone to come in and do some analysis of the water samples to see what can be done about that. But these are the kinds of issues that we encounter when architecture and public health come together, but we don't talk to each other often enough to realize that we're trying to deal with the same problems, but just in different ways. So I found that fascinating. I also think that the COVID-19 case is a really interesting case, and some of your remarks made me think about some of the early work on COVID. Louisiana was the first state to provide data on mortality, COVID mortality by race. And the earliest data showed that 70% of the deaths were in Louisiana were African American. Now later that data was cleaned up and it showed it wasn't quite 70%, but it was still a huge disparity. African Americans are about 32% of the population of Louisiana. And now, even now, still more than 50% of the deaths are African American. And people started talking about what was the reason for this? Why are African Americans dying at such high rates? And the explanation that started to gain currency was that it's because of underlying health conditions. African Americans have higher rates of hypertension and diabetes and obesity, asthma, COPD, and we know that if one is infected with the virus and have one of those underlying conditions, that their risk of death is much higher. right? So the idea was that African Americans wasn't taking a good enough care of themselves, and as a result, had these chronic conditions, and it's their fault. Even had heard the Surgeon General come out and make comments to that effect, which I found just um, lacking in awareness of some of the basic epidemiology. For example, there is a disparity in those underlying chronic conditions. African Americans do have higher rates than whites, but not nearly, that disparity is not nearly big enough to explain disparities in COVID deaths. Not just that, if you look at the rates of every one of those conditions here in Louisiana, the whites in Louisiana have higher rates of all of those conditions than blacks do in most other states. So if those underlying conditions was the cause of disparity of mortality from COVID, then there should be a much higher rate of death, and the disparities would not be as big as they are because whites have an extremely high rate of cancer, of diabetes, hypertension, obesity, and so on here. Instead, I posited that maybe it has nothing to do with underlying conditions, but in fact, it's really all structural. It's who gets infected, who has a job that places them at risk, who has a job that allows them to work from home on Zoom all day and still collect their full salary, and who has a job that makes it possible for people to do that. Who is bringing your food when you call Uber Eats? And disproportionately, it was people of color that was bringing that food. So when you envision the structural issue of segregation, the fact that we are a dramatically racially segregated society, and you envision the way that we believe New Orleans became one of the early hotspots, which was through Mardi Gras and visitors coming here, and genetic analysis of the virus here show that it was the infections from New York City that ultimately came here through Europe to New York City to New Orleans. It was likely someone who was visiting during Mardi Gras and infected people who were working in the hospitality industry here in New Orleans, and those people were disproportionately people of color who then went home to their racially segregated communities and infected other people, and that was how it spread. So while we in public health talk a lot about how segregation creates an infrastructure that allows for disease to spread within communities and exacerbate disparities, it's the similar problem as the built environment. Because as you point out, people do not necessarily, in fact, most people do not get to choose where they live. Their choices are constrained by a variety of factors, including earlier on redlining, and now today sort of de facto redlining that still occurs through lending practices of banks, for example, and discrimination from landlords. So this is a fascinating presentation for me to listen to, because to hear the role of the built environment, I thought was quite interesting. So I want to thank you for that. I also found interesting the point you were making about how blight removal was the justification for a lot of what happened. So I'm from New York City originally. We know that many of the iconic buildings in Manhattan were built was built in places that were once tenement housing. The tenement housing was razed. The people were moved to Brooklyn, which is where I grew up, and Lincoln Center and other buildings like that were built, which really moved the people, and with them the diseases that they had, and instead replaced them with facilities that were used more by people of privilege, and they were also buildings that were built in ways that were less apt to lead to disease spread, such as tenement houses in New York, that you find in Brooklyn that you no longer found in Midtown Manhattan. So this was really an interesting presentation for me to listen to, and I appreciate having had an opportunity to hear it. And I'll stop there and see what the other architects has to say about this presentation.
Well, Sarah, I also found it very interesting. And you know, I have a public health background, but I'm embedded in the Community Design Center and in the School of Architecture. So I feel like I'm always translating like vocabulary back and forth sometimes. And one of the things that, and then I want us to move to questions really quickly, because I feel like I don't always need to, I think what Dean Levice shared, he brought up so many good points. And so I just feel like we should move to questions shortly. But one of the things that I think stands out to me about the presentation that you touched on slightly is just the context of climate change and what that means in the now and the future for these decision-making processes, and how all, to me, the conversations about the conversation you had about blight, which I think is related to conversations about relocation. Dean Levice, you brought up the water infrastructure in the city itself, and drinking water, and then stormwater management. And I think we're at a point where, when we're thinking about the social, environment, economic impacts on health, that climate change is an overarching context that we're functioning in today. And I think when we're thinking about the built environment, whether it be the built environment and the natural and the built environment, it seems to me that that's a place where we're going to have to engage when it comes to like our physical, mental, just our physical and mental well-being. I mean, that quotation you had, I tried to jot it down. But that, you know, that the landscape we embed and inhabit in our bodies, I'm gonna miss it, but it's like in our bones. And I feel like a lot of the things you brought up and the structural, just the structural issues and the social ecological environment, they're embedded in our bones, right? And I feel like climate change is a place where we're seeing it now, and the inequities that you raised, we're seeing it in responses to climate change, whether it be where resilient projects that are quote unquote resilient are being, what that means when we do water projects that are increasing resilience, and how does that translate to increased housing values or reduced housing values, or when we're looking at relocation projects. And so the same kind of inequity, I think, that you highlighted historically is playing out now. So I'll just tag that. And then I also would like us to talk about housing more broadly, because I think something we're going to see and perhaps in this moment is the quality of housing, that the asthma that we know is, and the poor quality of housing and indoor air quality that has been a long-term issue, in part related to structural inequity and racism that exists in our society. That is going to continue to play out as we move from this moment where, if COVID, if we're no longer able to prevent displacement, or prevent evictions, the eviction hold, I'll put it in quotes because I want to say that it's completely on hold. I'm concerned about what that means for quality of housing moving forward and where people will be. So I'll just posit those things, and let's have a conversation. I think that's much more.
Yeah, and I'll let the Q&A come in, but I just want to add, yes, thank you, Anna. And I think that's definitely where my research is going now, is I think we cannot forget climate change. Climate change was the biggest threat to our health pre-pandemic, and it will continue to be. And when we talk about inequities of communities of color, it's almost a triple whammy. I think, like, not only have these communities been conscribed to landscapes of risk because of redlining, because of policy, but now I'm actually working on a research project with my colleague Jay Cephas that's trying to find outlines of climate change events, from flooding to wildfire and now extreme heat, right? And think about like how the environment really sort of like is a triple threat, honestly, to people that are living there, because of probably the most vulnerable places in our landscape.
I have a first question. Where does urban and restoration ecology fit into a broader empirical basis for human health co-benefits? And then by extension, how is the landscape architecture approaching plant and species selection to remediate urban heat islands, toxic soils, and other such challenges that divide the urban environmental disparities?
You know, thanks, Jesse. I just see Jesse. Thank you for that question. And I guess I'll start as the landscape architect. I think we're probably not talking enough about the specifics of the power of landscape to remediate toxic soils. But I would say, you know, one front where there is a lot of promising research is just thinking about expansion of the urban forest and shade. This is another, you know, really crucial topic when thinking about landscape and health, and we're thinking about mitigating heat islands. Is a lot of times these communities that suffer disparities in health have less urban forest cover, right? That has been proven empirically by you know, projects at MIT and at Harvard that are looking at the urban forest, and in turn that can again, it makes places hotter. It doesn't provide people relief from the heat, and it's only going to become more important with climate change. That said, you know, we hear a lot about how trees will save health, trees will save the city, and it's actually so much more complicated than that. When I was doing the research, when I was doing research for the book, I was highlighting the work of a group called Groundwork in Lawrence, Massachusetts, that was looking to, you know, do a tree planting campaign there. And it was, you know, you have to think about when you're changing the landscape of a community, especially vulnerable communities, it's not just about putting the plants there, but it's about thinking about the maintenance, right? And that can actually lead to worse outcomes if you just do an intervention, but don't provide the maintenance. And that's sort of what we saw with public housing as well. And so thinking about investment in the area, providing that maintenance, making sure you're not adding more labor to some of these communities is really key, and having the buy-in. So even, you know, if you hear that, oh, it's easy, just plant a tree, there's a lot of decisions that have to come into that. But yeah, we may not be talking enough about toxic soils. I have a really great colleague at Northeastern, Kate Kennan. If you haven't heard of her, she wrote a great book called Phyto, which is about phytoremediation. And we've been in preliminary conversations talking about, because I'm fascinated by the process of how you might even turn over some of these paved areas. But again, it's a process. It's much, much harder, you know, than a drawing would have it appear. But I'm asking her questions about how you turn over auto infrastructure, right? Because we may have unused auto infrastructure, unused parking garages, unused parking lots post-COVID if less people are commuting. So I think there's a real potential there to think about that process, to think about it scientifically of how we convert those areas. That said, you know, always making sure that it's done equitably as well.
So I have a question.
Sure.
Is that allowed? Can I ask a question? Or?
Please,
Okay.
I'd love to hear it.
So I'd like to push you a bit to talk a bit about solutions. Okay, so we are where we are, and there's been, you know, there's a whole history that determines the, you know, I guess the built environment in a variety of different parts of a city, right? And so if you look at this city, for example, you can sort of see the architecture and a lot of what you describe, you know, from you know, 19th century and even before, and how it impacted health. You see in a city like this. How do we move forward? How do we improve on, or how do we change or improve the quality of housing to improve health?
Anne is more embedded with these issues, I know, and I'd love to hear her response. But I'll start just by thinking, I think one is something I really advocate for with my students is one thing we can do to move on, I think, from the worse impulses of architecture, right, to provide housing, and in terms of some of the public housing that I talked about here, is first of all, remember housing is deeply personal. Housing is connected to place, that there is no generic solution and there are no anonymous users, right? And so I think when you talk about solutions for housing, it does start with that investigation of place and investigation of what people are willing to accept. That said, I think it's interesting that I feel like sometimes I'm still advocating for this connection between the environment and health outcomes, and especially the design of housing and health. So I think it starts with advocacy to let people know that that housing is health, the provision of housing is health, but also what it looks like and where it's built. That said, I think we have to shift the paradigm a little bit. Somebody asked me, a reporter asked me in the beginning of the pandemic if this was the end of cities, if the pandemic was the end of cities, and of course, like, we'll see where everybody settles out. I don't think it is, but I did say, I did let her know that this country is very afraid of density, right? And I think as architects, we're always advocating for density, and you're likely to get a lot of pushback. So it's up to us as designers to think more in a nuanced way about density, but it's also going to take a little bit more public acceptance of building a little bit more densely. And I'm not talking like the large towers, right, that you build or raise neighborhoods for, but knowing with climate change coming, right, knowing that to provide more walkable and bikeable access, we are going to have to shift those conceptions of density, and that's for everybody. So I think it sort of depends, I think, on what population you're talking to as well. But we are going to have to accept that we need to build up a little bit while not dehumanizing, right, people that live in that housing as well. And do you have any thoughts about this?
I wish I had answers. I don't,
Yeah,
right? I feel like I wish I could say, here are the five things that we need to do or can do. I do feel this is not an architectural solution, so I'm not focused on that, but I do think that part of this is about advocacy and political power. And I don't know, I'm always worried about saying what gets copied, but the idea that tenants, like in Louisiana, renters do not have a lot of rights. And so the reality is that there's not a lot of recourse if you are living in an environment that is moldy or doesn't have heat or light. I mean, I think we're at a point where unless one of the solutions has to be sort of political and legal changes that give renters and renters in particular more rights when it comes to when they're negotiating with landlords, in particular in a city like ours, where we still have the number of renters is quite high. And I think the idea that that is a piece of it. And I think you brought up, Sara, you said something about health and the connections to housing. And I think the idea that housing is I hate to be sort of, I don't know, just quick with this, but like housing is a human right, like healthy housing and high quality housing that is not filled with mold or collapsing ceilings, the basic human elements of what we would consider a healthy indoor and housing environment, something that we have to really think about. And that's not, I think some of those are practical, and when we're thinking about housing advocacy, that's a key component when we think about renters' rights and who has the ability to advocate for healthy housing. So I think that's a piece of it for sure in this city more broadly. And then structurally, I also think we know that the, and Dean Least, you brought this up, just that, you know, we know that banks and both banks and valuation of housing is still a race, like there's still racism involved in that practice and devaluing. And so I think until some of those things change, we're gonna continue to see challenges.
Here's another question. What are some cities that have been taking significant steps towards remediating high density health impacts? Do we have any examples? And if so, what kind of were the elements of the urban and structural design that helped and had the biggest impact on public health?
So there's a lot of, I don't know if it's, so like everything else, it's a complicated answer, right? I think there are some real promising, there have been some promising initiatives taken in some cities. One thing I found really interesting was, you know, the case of Oklahoma City. I wrote a little bit about it in the book, but where the mayor there actually decided to, you know, invest $100 million in combating obesity, but did it through the built environment. And it was building a large park. It was building more active recreation around their river, and they actually did see lowered rates of obesity there. But again, the complicated question is when we start to build for the conceptions of health, it's not just about building it, but it's about protecting the most vulnerable. And I mean, you know, one thing I always point to is the example of, okay, so let's say Portland, Oregon. So Portland, Oregon is famously a city that, you know, is very tightly controls their built environment. You know, most would say has a very pleasant density. In fact, somebody that I worked with in Sacramento, she would actually, they actually took stakeholders up to Portland to see, like, this is what density could look like. It's okay to have a bus stop in your neighborhood, right? It's okay to have walkable streets. It can look like it can look like this, to let them inhabit it and see what sort of pleasant, livable density looks like. They've invested in green streets. They've invested in bike lanes. The problem, they have a growth boundary, right? Famously too. So they're thinking about building more densely. The problem is there, it has become unaffordable to lots of people, and it is primarily a white city. And so I think it's not maybe, I think we just have to realize these things go hand in hand. And I think that's what I try and point out in the book, is if we are just building for health and we're not thinking about these other structural issues, like who might get displaced. Another example is the, you know, the link between green space and gentrification. And in fact, even Olmsted, right, was able to build Central Park by saying, well, the real estate values will rise around it. So this is why you should let me build a park here, but not yet connecting it, you know, to the health effects of displacement and gentrification. And so it's hard to say if there's a city that's done it successfully, because this idea that I think we have to think about this complicated web of actions where health is wanted, right? And there's a demand for health. So how do we provide health for all while still not moving people out of their neighborhoods? I was just talking to my class. I actually teach a seminar on designing for health at Northeastern. And I think the other part we have to remember is, you know, Dean Levees is familiar with the socio-ecological model, right? Which is like, it's nesting. It's like, I told my students, it's like a Russian doll, right? And there's one tiny doll at the center, and that is the individual. But there are all these layers on the outside that affect one and the other, and they radiate in and out. And the built environment is actually just one of those circles. And it's somewhere between policy and it's and just above interpersonal relationships. And all these things have a connection to each other. So it's not really about the design, but it's being cognizant of these reciprocal relationships, and that is what forms the built environment, not just the design of it.
And Sarah, something that popped into my mind as you were speaking is just thinking about how we define health and who gets to define what
Right.
healthy is. And that seems to be an important part of this conversation, because I would say, having sort of sit in the architecture design space and in the public health space, I feel like public health professionals, architects, and people working in the built environment often define, like they've decided, or I'll say they, like I've been both in some ways, but like the definitions of health often are a top down, come from the top down, and I think the idea of what healthy means and how we create spaces to think about, as professionals, whatever that role is how do you have conversations about what healthy means, for individuals, and for we can have broader definitions of what health means, from a cultural standpoint. But if you forget sort of the socio-ecological and where we sit, I think that becomes really important. So there's individual conversations about healthy and what we mean by healthy, I think becomes just really, really important. You know, coming from a rural, like I live here in New Orleans now, but coming from a rural space, what healthy looked like and how my family defined healthy might be very different than, you know, how my neighbors defined healthy, or just what rural and urban and health looks like. I just think we need to really think about how we define healthy as professionals, and how that idea of our personal ideas of health translate into these plans, that may or may not reflect like just the diversity of perspectives of what health and healthy is, and prioritization, perhaps that the prioritization of what we think is important in healthy environments.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, as Dean Levis pointed out, you know, when I started doing my PhD work, I grabbed like every manual and every like piece of writing about healthy cities, right, that I could find, because I was trying to think, okay, what is their conception of a healthy city? What is the design of a healthy city? And, you know, predominantly they were talking about active communities, because there was a sort of a obsession with obesity, right, and physical activity. But what we can't forget is, you know, there are still communities without the basic provisions of clean soil, clean water, clean air, right? And especially with that connection to the COVID-19 pandemic, let's connect that to the COVID-19 pandemic, and not, you know, quarantine rooms or circles in parks. There are still some very urgent health issues that need to be addressed through the built environment. I think absolutely, and what you just said, prioritization is so key.
So something you said, I found intriguing as well. Two things. One is you talked about Portland, and I wonder, as the city you selected as an example of a city that, well, you didn't quite say they did everything right, but they did things better than many other cities. Is the health status of people in Portland better than before they made whatever changes they made there, or is it better than other cities?
I mean, that's also like, again, as Anne was saying, like, how do you define health, right? And there's so many different ways to define health. Is it through the obesity rates? Is it through hospitalizations, right? Is it through asthma rates and that? And I think, you know, a lot of people would put Portland high on the list for, say, physical activity, right? For people getting a certain amount of physical activity per day. But, you know, does that tell the whole story? I mean, and actually, funnily enough, Hawaii, where I lived for 4 years, right? Hawaii is often held up as as one of the healthiest places in the United States, but there are vast health disparities there too, especially between Native Hawaiians, you know, white residents of Hawaii, and there's even a stratification between different Asian groups that live there as well. There's a lot of health disparities between, say, you know, the Japanese population and the Filipino population that live in Hawaii. So when we think about like what is health. I think that's the thing is like when we talk about what is healthy, what are the metrics that we are looking at? And often enough, it's not the equity question, right? Are we looking at actually accessible healthcare for all? But in fact, it's based on some other metric, right? That
Yeah,
tends to.
but you can link the question back to the individuals that live in those communities, right?
Mhm.
Deal with the equity issue. Is it that people that live in those types of environments, are they healthier? I mean, that isn't a perfect question. That's a
Yeah, it's a very question. It's not. It's a good question. It's not one I don't know if I can answer it.
right.
I guess yeah. It's
Okay, and I mean,
yeah.
and I had another observation. You talked about, building for health can also lead to, making housing unaffordable. And
Mhm.
as someone who just moved to New Orleans, I would say that housing in New Orleans is outrageously expensive and unaffordable. And it doesn't appear to me that there's been a lot of new construction in this city um, recently.
Mhm.
I struggled to find a house that I was willing to pay that amount of money for. You're looking at 200-year-old houses that cost over $1 million, and I'm just struggling to envision how is this house with that literally that piece of wood on the wall there was nailed there in, I don't know, 1920 or even earlier, and how is that piece of wood now worth 5 or 6 times more than it was back then?
Yeah.
And so there are a lot of things that drive housing prices, and I would not, um, and it's not just building for health.
No, but it's also the availability, right? Sort of like that's a big part of it. That's a huge part of it, actually. Like there's some basic parts of that as well. And yeah, and actually, I'm not sure what changed either. When I lived in New Orleans, let's see now, 13 years ago, it was famously like quite affordable. And then after Hurricane Katrina, there was a period of transition, and then all of a sudden uh, I mean, not all of a sudden, but it's, as you just mentioned, it's quite unaffordable now. And so yes, there are many other factors besides just sort of a preconception of what healthy design looks like.
I feel
Health,
like
health,
housing in New Orleans, oops, sorry, Rich. I was going to say housing in New Orleans could be a whole nother topic. Now I'm going to give it to you, Rich. Sorry, I feel like we could have a whole nother lecture series day.
Yeah, I know we're closing here. I'm gonna put my email address in the chat because I know we didn't get to all the questions. It's sa.carr@northeastern.edu. So thank you very much, Dean Lebeast and Anne, for taking the time tonight.
All right, that'll wrap up our evening. Thank you, Sarah, Thomas, and Kristen, and everyone else, and all of you for joining us. You're invited to join us next week on Monday, March 8th, same time, to hear Monica Rivera discuss human inhabitation and aging. Until then, let's have a hand for Sara, Jensen, Carr, and our respondents. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.